Boldwood presents Fool's Gold, written by Gillian Godden and read by Fiona Honan-Bowes. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Reflection. Isn't it strange how your life can change just as quickly as flicking a switch? One moment in time can change your whole future, sometimes for the good or the bad. You really don't know until you follow the path put in front of you. Looking out of the window as the train sped past trees and houses, a feeling of foreboding gripped Julie. Suddenly she felt sick. What was she doing, especially with a man she hardly knew, an ex-con with fingers in more pies than a baker? Thinking about her life and the difficulties in it, Julie felt she didn't have many regrets. There was no point. A lot of her lifestyle was her own doing, but she'd never been given a chance to be anything else. Was this the crossroads to a brighter future, or just another mistake in her life? It had already been filled with sadness and dead ends. In addition, she'd done her fair share of evil deeds to survive and realised she'd rarely done anything for herself. It had always been for the good of someone else. Was this her chance to make something good for herself? A few days ago in her bedsit in Liverpool, it had all seemed so feasible. Making love and spending time with Ralph Gold seemed like the only thing in the world that mattered. No sooner had he proposed than he turned on his heel, made his excuses about business and left. He'd told her to sort things out in Liverpool and join him as soon as possible in London. The sound of a baby crying broke into her thoughts, and turning around she could see a young woman embarrassed and apologising to the people around her. The more the baby cried as she held it to her shoulder and patted its back to soothe it, the more she apologised. It seemed everyone had turned towards the woman, making the situation even worse. The elderly couple opposite Julie were tutting and looking annoyed as they tried to read their paper. Instantly she thought of her small nephew Josh. How she wished she could hear him cry like that. Julie had to leave him behind at the hospital with only her old neighbour Gertie to visit him and the nurses to watch over him in his incubator full of wires and tubes to help him breathe. He had another chest infection. No one had expected him to survive. However, he had proved to be a fighter against all the odds, and whatever problems he would face in the future, Julie just knew the little boy would show the same spirit he had demonstrated since birth. It was a foregone conclusion that he would have some form of mental health problems. Josh had been born a heroin addict due to her own sister Frankie's addiction, although no one would know to what extent he'd been affected until he was older. Although she'd agreed to meet Ralph in London, she sorely wished she hadn't. She hadn't thought it through properly. As the train stopped at each station, she felt the sudden impulse to get off and leave this promise of a bright future behind her. After all, promises were like pie crusts. They were meant to be broken. "For Christ's sake, Julie," she mentally scolded herself. "You look desperate and foolish, and you always swore you'd never let any man make a fool of you." Looking up at the elderly couple facing her and the strange stares they gave her and each other, Julie realised she must have been thinking aloud. Oh, she felt she was going crazy, and now she was talking to herself in public. Craning her neck to look over at the woman again, it saddened her. Frankie, her sister, should be sitting like that, holding her baby to her bosom and nursing it. Instead, she'd lived an awful life, surrounded by drugs and prostitution, and after giving birth to Josh, she had died. It all seemed so long ago, and yet it was just a matter of a few months. Josh would now be in Julie's care. She would look after him the way she had tried her best to look after Frankie. Neither of them had anyone else. Julie's mother was still alive, but currently serving a prison sentence for murder, so was in no position to look after a baby. "Do you want a cup of tea from the Buffy bar or something?" she shouted across the other passengers' heads. Pleased to see the woman half smile as she looked up at her, Julie smiled back reassuringly. There was no point in asking. That poor woman was in dire need of a cup of something, preferably laced with gin. "Don't worry about this lot, love. They have obviously just arrived from Mars and never heard a baby cry before. God help their own kids." Ignoring the other passengers' stares, Julie got up and stumbled her way through the aisle of the train to the buffet carriage. Ordering 2 cups of tea and a chocolate bar, she opened her purse and saw that she only had £20 in it. Ralph had given her the money for the train ticket, and stupidly, for the first time in her life, blinded by excitement, she'd forgotten to ask for more. More to the point, he hadn't offered any more. She had given Gertie a few pounds towards a bus fare to go and see Josh, and had bought a new top to look her best for when Ralph met her at the station. The money in her purse was all she had left in the world. Maybe, she mused. Although she knew Ralph was a man of his word, she was nervous. Prostitution was a past life. She'd done what she had needed to survive. But now she'd found a good, honest man, and he deserved the best. Doubting herself, Julie knew they were worlds apart, but she was determined to make him proud of her and not regret his decision. He deserved the best, and that was what she would give him, putting her seedy past behind her. This was a fresh start with a man she loved and who loved her. Who could ask for anything else? Disappointment and doubts hung in the air like a cloud over her peroxide blonde hair. Ralph had only been out of prison a few days when he had come to visit her and had proposed, but now she wondered if he'd really meant it. Had it just been freedom talking, all his plans just pent-up desires he'd been thinking about in his cell? She could always go back to prostitution, she decided, while waiting for the woman behind the counter to stop talking to her colleague and eventually pour the tea. It was an honest trade and never went out of fashion. But just thinking about going back to that life made Julie feel like crying. Her hands felt sweaty as the train moved closer and closer to London. Had this all been some stupid pipe dream? Businessmen didn't marry women like herself. They were mistresses and someone to use when you felt the urge. For the first time in years, she felt frightened and worried. She hated weakness. She'd learned from experience that showing your weaknesses gave other people control over you. She had always been the strong one and looked after everyone else. Now she wished she had someone to look after her. There was no one to turn to for help. Maybe that was why she wanted to believe Ralph Gold and all of his promises of their future together. She was tired of the life she was living and realised she was going nowhere fast. Moreover, there was little Josh. She would make damn sure, whatever happened, that he would always know where the next meal was coming from. She would pet and spoil him and make his childhood memorable for all the right reasons. Picking up the 2 cardboard cups of tea, the jewelled fingers on her hands sparkled. Ralph had given the rings to her when he had proposed. Well, that was another option. If they were real, she would have something to pawn. They looked genuine enough, but now she wasn't so sure. With her mind racing in all directions, with every negative thought bouncing around in her head, she tried reasoning with herself. She liked Ralph Gold, and she had trusted and believed his plans for their future. He was a quiet man who noticed everything but said nothing. He was a closed book. Even his facial expressions didn't portray what he was thinking. For all of his money, he showed little bravado. He was a thinker, and surely a man like that wouldn't make rash proposals to women. The overly hot tea nearly burnt her mouth as she took a sip. It hadn't helped that the train had jolted and she'd taken a bigger sip of the hot liquid than intended. "For God's sake, do British Rail try and kill all of their customers? Put some bloody cold water in these, will you, and be grateful I'm not suing you. You can always put your complaint in writing." "Well, maybe I will, you snotty cow, standing there gossiping with your mate. I wonder what British Rail would think about you ignoring your customers." Snapping and glaring at the woman behind the counter, she waited until the woman poured some cold water into the cups and steadied herself as she walked back to her seat. She wanted to lash out at someone, anyone. She knew she'd made a fool of herself believing Ralph. Anyway, it served that snotty cow right. She took a cup over to the woman with the baby, who by now seemed to be getting quieter in the care of its mother's soothing voice and with the motion of the train settling it. "Here, take this. And this. Sorry there's no brandy in it." Looking down at the baby and handing over the chocolate bar to the woman, Julie smiled as the grateful, tired woman held her free hand out for the cup. "How much do I owe you, the flustered woman with the baby asked Julie while trying to reach for her bag. Julie shook her head. "Julie, no, you don't owe me anything, love. What is it?" "It's a boy, Stephen." "Thank you, Julie." For the first time on the journey, Julie saw a faint smile on the woman's face. Looking at the healthy baby before her stabbed her heart. Josh should be sitting on his mum's lap like that, annoying people with his cries. Walking away from this happy scene of mother and child, Julie squeezed herself back into the seat opposite the elderly couple. Their sideways glance at each other as she sat down made her blood boil. "What are you two nosy bastards staring at?" Not answering, they turned their heads and looked out of the window, ignoring her comment. They treated her as if she was something they'd just wiped off their shoes. Tentatively taking another sip of the tea, Julie started the mental conversation in her mind again while looking out of the window at the houses in the distance, replaying the last week in her head. Why had she fallen for this man's charming fantasy? Deep down she knew why. It was simple, because Ralph Gold was the only man who had ever treated her like a lady. She'd never known anyone like him. He was an unpretentious man. The calming Irish side of him put her at ease, and his sense of humour matched her own. The mixture of the deep green eyes of his mother and the black hair from his Jewish father made him look distinctive. He too had been a survivor, and now, through protection rackets and his connections with organised crime, he had become a very rich businessman. Although he was a quietly spoken man, she knew he didn't suffer fools gladly, and business was business. Ralph Gold was a man to be reckoned with. Even though they'd met a couple of times by chance, the timing hadn't been quite right for them, and when they had at last met properly, while she had been an escort and he was a client, they had clicked straight away. None of her past had bothered Ralph. He had quoted sayings from the Bible when she had shown concerns, possibly his Catholic mother's words. "Julie," he had said, "judge not that ye be not judged." Ralph knew that to survive in this world you had to use whatever means you had. He had his own stories of how he'd started out, bare-knuckle fighting for a few pounds. Even though he was older than her, the chemistry between them had been right. Instinctively, they both knew they had found their soulmate. He had shown her respect, and their love-making. Yes, she admitted to herself, it was love-making, was a two-way street. It wasn't self-gratification for an hour. She had never felt like this before and didn't like the feeling of not being in control of the situation. Raising her cup to her mouth, Julie noticed the woman opposite her admiring the rings on her fingers. Purposely, Julie laid a hand on the table in front of her to give the woman a better look. Getting the reaction she wanted and raising her eyes to her, Julie smiled. She could feel the sarcasm already dripping from her mouth. Nice, aren't they? Waving her fingers around to let the light from the window make them glisten and sparkle, she paused for effect. It's a shame the jeweller's was shut when he bought yours.
That's my wife you're talking to. Stop being so rude.
The man jumped in quickly to prevent his wife from further embarrassment. You said it, honey. She's your wife and that's your problem. Better luck next time. Julie's red, glossy lips portrayed a wide grin. She was ready for a fight. She wanted one. All the pent-up tension inside of her felt like poison that needed to pour out of her, a boil that needed lancing. Don't, Rodney. She's not worth it. She's not our sort of person. Look how she's dressed in that short skirt and low top. Feeling angry at the snub and comments, Julie's face flushed. Well, he likes my low top, dear. At least everything's pointing north. Your tits went south years ago. But as she looked at her reflection in the window, she couldn't help feeling that maybe they had a point. She looked exactly what she was, a tart. Now her self-esteem dropped even lower. She thought she'd been clever, snapping at this couple, ready for battle. But in fact it was them who'd won the war. The announcement from the train driver almost made her blood run cold. She couldn't change her clothes now. It was too late. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now approaching King's Cross Station. Everyone jumped from their seats, started collecting their bags from the overhead luggage rails and made their way to the centre aisle. Watching them all, Julie remained in her seat. She didn't know what lay ahead of her. She felt nervous as the train came to a halt and people started getting off. She desperately needed a cigarette. Thank you for your kindness, Julie. A voice broke into her thoughts. She turned and saw the woman with the baby, who had now decided to go to sleep. No problem, darling. Take care. Suddenly Julie didn't want to get off. What was the point? But realising she was the only person left in the carriage and the train staff were walking down the aisles with rubbish bags collecting all the empty crisp packets and sweet wrappers left by the passengers, she stood up and walked towards the luggage compartment near the doors and picked up her holdalls. It wasn't much to show for a lifetime. 2 bloody holdalls. They contained everything she had in the world. Making her way along the platform amongst all the passengers, some waiting to get on the train and others making their way to the exit, Julie followed the crowd and tried to find her way out. What time is the next train to Liverpool? She asked one of the guards standing at the gates. His answer that it would only be a couple of hours made her feel better. Time enough to sell these rings and go home. Walking out of the dark station and shielding her eyes from the sunlight, she heard someone shout. Looking around, she heard her name. Are you Julie? A young man sitting on the bonnet of an expensive car smoking a cigarette pointed at her. My name is Julie, she stammered. Who are you? Puzzled, she stood rooted to the spot. Are you Ralph's Julie from Liverpool?" "I suppose so." Julie felt herself blush, not quite knowing what to say. Flicking his cigarette on the floor, he walked over to her and held his hand out for her bags. "I thought I'd missed you. Everyone else came out ages ago." "Look, Sonny, I asked you who you were. Now, before you run off with my bags, do you want to answer me? Didn't Ralph tell you? I'm here to pick you up. I drive for him sometimes. You don't think he'd let you catch the bus to the hotel, do you?" His smile was warm and friendly as he opened the boot of the car and reached out for her bags again. His attempts to sound posh with his Cockney accent made Julie smile as she handed over her bags to him. Taking out a handkerchief, he opened the back door and made a point of dusting it before she got in. Finding this all very funny and getting in the car, relief washed over her. Ralph hadn't forgotten about her at all. Whether he was going to marry her or not, he still wanted to see her. The heavy London traffic slowed down the journey to the hotel. "Well, you know my name, so what's yours?" Trying to sound more confident than she felt, she decided to make small talk. This way she might get some information about what Ralph had said about her. "Christopher, but everyone calls me Chris." He seemed friendly and chirpy enough with his easy Cockney manner. "Do you have a spare cigarette, Chris?" She knew that he did because she'd seen him smoking outside of the train station. He handed her his cigarette packet and lighter over his shoulder while he kept his eyes on the road. "Is it okay if I smoke in here? I'll open the window." "Yes, course. I'll open the back window for you. They're electric, you know," he boasted proudly as he pressed the button to open the window. "How come Ralph didn't come and meet me then?" "Dunno, Julie. You don't mind me calling you Julie, do you?" He paused. "That's my name. Do you mind me calling you Chris?" Julie laughed. He was obviously very nervous. "Dunno why Ralph couldn't come. Busy, I suppose. He just rang me and told me to go to King's Cross Station and meet a blonde woman called Julie. When I asked him how I'd recognise you, he laughed and said, 'Oh, you'll know her when you see her, Chris, but keep your hands to yourself. She bites.'" They both burst out laughing. Then Chris shouted out of the window to some driver who had just cut across him. Inhaling on her long-awaited cigarette, she blew the smoke out of the window and looked at all the people rushing around on the pavements going about their daily routines. Fleetingly, Julie remembered the last time she'd been in London. She'd not been the usual tourist. She'd come on a mission to commit murder and even the score on an old friend. These were very different circumstances. Remembering Donna and her fateful ending stabbed at Julie's heart. They'd been friends, good friends, and had worked at Carrie Smeltzer's brothel together. It still made Julie wince when she thought about how it could have so easily been herself that had been murdered by that sadist client. He had handcuffed Donna to the bed, face down, and not even realised while he was having sex with her that he was pushing her face into the pillows, suffocating her. When Julie had heard his screams of panic and run upstairs, she hadn't known what had shocked her more, the fact that he had killed Donna, or the fact that he was a police officer who enjoyed going to swinger parties with his wife. The brothel where they had worked had hosted the party, but the girls who worked there were strictly off-limits unless paid, and Inspector Connor was a sadistic man who had paid Donna for sex. This had been her fateful ending. When Julie had wanted to telephone the police, Carrie had been afraid of the scandal and had succumbed to Connor's pleadings. His wife, who was also in the police force, had instructed Julie and Carrie to leave the house so that they could dispose of the evidence and Donna's body. Julie's stomach had turned. It had been 3 against 1. No matter how many times she had tried to convince Carrie to call the police to this murder scene, she had been ignored.
She didn't stand a chance. Who would believe some prostitute against the might of the police force? It had made Julie feel sick when days later there were reports about a woman's body being found in the river, and it had broken her heart. Through Ralph Gold, she had been given the chance for long-awaited vengeance when the same police officer who had killed Donna had also been investigating Ralph. With the help of Ralph's mafia connections, she had been given the opportunity to go to the hotel room where Connor was protecting a witness and had shot him. She felt justice had been served, but it would never bring Donna back. Even now, the thought of Donna brought a tear to her eye. But Julie's actions had brought closure, and wherever Donna was now, hopefully this had given her peace. Chris pulled into the hotel right at the front doors. "That guy at the front will find a parking space for us while I'll settle you in." Getting out, Chris opened the back door for her. She'd worked many hotels in the past as an escort, but nothing in this league. It felt intimidating, and she looked down at her clothing again and pulled her coat around her. "I'm not sure if Ralph will be back yet, so let's get you signed in." Throwing the car keys to the waiting valet standing on the steps, Chris picked up the holdalls and opened the doors for Julie. "Gold is the name." Standing there, straightening his tie, Chris flaunted his importance. "Mrs. Gold, how lovely to meet you at last. Your husband said you would be joining him today. He's not back yet, but he left this for you, and there is champagne and strawberries in your room." Turning to a pigeonhole behind reception, the receptionist took out an envelope and handed it to Julie with her best rehearsed smile. "If you need anything, just ring down and we'll arrange it for you." "Do you want me to carry your bags upstairs?" Coughing behind them to get their attention, a porter reached down for Julie's bags. "I will take it from here, sir." "No, Chris, I'm okay. Thank you." "Oh, here are your cigarettes. Sorry." "Keep 'em. I've got more in the car." "Just one thing." His cheeks flushed with embarrassment as he looked down and kicked the highly polished reception desk, much to the annoyance of the receptionist. "Don't suppose you would put a good word in with Ralph about being his permanent driver, would you? I've looked after you, haven't I? I know he likes to drive himself and just uses a driver now and again, but he's a good bloke, your Ralph," he said, looking sheepish and younger than his years. Julie nodded. "Rest assured, I will mention it to Ralph about how well you've looked after me. Thank you." Reaching over for the pen and paper on the desk, he wrote down his telephone number. "Just in case you need it, eh?" Taking the paper from him, Julie put it in her handbag. "Thanks. I dare say I'm going to need someone to carry my bags and drive me around." She winked and watched the smile appear on his face again. "You make sure you look after her proper like, or Mr. Gold will hear about it, and he will have something to say to you," Chris warned, wagging his finger at the receptionist, which did not impress her much. She looked him up and down with distaste at his dropped vowels. After a quick ride in the lift, Julie waited while the porter opened the bedroom door for her. Once inside, she looked around at the lavish surroundings of the hotel room, trying her best to hide her shock from the porter. This wasn't a hotel room, it was a full suite and looked like an apartment. She never knew hotels had rooms like this, and she had worked in a lot of them. It was somewhere a pop star or a famous movie star would stay. There was a dining room and a lounge area complete with large sofas, a television and thick rugs laid on the floor. Julie had never seen anything like it before. Oh, this was another world. The bedroom was en suite with bath and shower, but there was also a spare toilet down the corridor. She could have fitted a small bedsit into this place 5 times over. Smiling to herself, Julie realised the closest she had come to one of these posh showers before with its glass surrounding was when she walked in the rain. Breaking into her thoughts, the porter spoke. "Would you like me to pour some champagne for you, madam?" Walking across to the silver tray that rested on the well-stocked mahogany bar, he took out the bottle of champagne and popped the cork. Once he had poured her drink, he put the bottle into a large silver bucket full of ice. This was pure luxury. For once, Julie was being treated like a very special lady. She'd always accepted people's opinions of her as part of life, but Ralph Gold was changing all of that. She was starting to be given respect and treated accordingly. He was a very special man, and she realised how lucky she was. It wasn't the money. There was always someone with money. But you couldn't buy what she felt for Ralph at this moment in time, and it was impossible to describe it. In an instant, he had turned her life around. The past was well and truly behind her. She was going to be Mrs. Ralph Gold, and he would never doubt his decision to marry her. She would make sure of that. She felt like a queen and couldn't stop smiling. Wanting to laugh, Julie took the glass from the porter. She'd been called Madam before, but not in this context. Noticing he was hovering around, plumping pillows and checking the curtains, it dawned on Julie that he was waiting for his tip. Taking out £5 from her bag, grudgingly she handed it over. Her money was dwindling fast, but she couldn't look like a cheapskate and just give him 50p. Although he didn't look impressed, he took it anyway and left. For the first time all day she could relax. Kicking her shoes off and taking another drink of her champagne, she walked over to the windows and looked out. She hadn't expected to be here in London drinking champagne. During her nerve-wracking journey, this was the last thing she'd thought about. Opening the balcony windows and letting the cool breeze in, she stepped out to look at London in all of its glory. In the distance, she could see the top of St. Paul's Cathedral. The skyline was full of other famous buildings. Leaning on the barrier, she sipped her champagne and looked down. Cars of all shapes and sizes were coming to the hotel, and the hustle and bustle of the valets meeting them interested her. And the well-known shops in the distance seemed to be full of people carrying their designer shopping bags. She'd always enjoyed people watching, and this was the perfect place to do it. Feeling the stress leaving her body, she looked around. The excitement building up inside of her made her feel like a kid at Christmas. She wanted to pinch herself. Surely this couldn't be true. The theatre billboards in the distance took her attention. Smiling to herself, she craned her neck to look at all the famous names of plays she had only heard about. This was living. Taking stock of London and the hundreds of people going about their business, Julie made a mental note to herself. She was going to take London by storm. She would make London her place. She would wear all of those fancy designer clothes and reinvent herself. Gone was the old Julie. This was a fresh start with a new life, and she was determined to grasp it with both hands. Walking back into the lounge, she filled her glass again and thought about Ralph. She didn't know when to expect him, but remembering that the hotel staff had called her Mrs. Gold made her smile. So that was Ralph's game, was it? Spinning a respectable line to the reception staff that he was expecting his wife. Looking over at the large four-poster bed, it looked inviting. This had seemed like the longest day in her life, and now the adrenaline was wearing off. She felt tired. Maybe she would have a nap before Ralph turned up. Walking into the bathroom, she spied all the wonderful soaps and scented oils left by the hotel. Deciding to have a bath first, she walked over and turned the large gold taps. As the bath began to fill, she poured in the bottle of bubble bath. It was a nice feeling running a hot bath without having to put money into the meter and waiting for the water to boil in the immersion tank as she had at her bedsit. Watching the liquid burst into a scented foam on the water made her feel better already. Walking into the bedroom again, she poured herself another glass of champagne and then saw the envelope the receptionist had given her earlier. She'd forgotten all about it. Opening it, she saw that it was full of money. She couldn't believe her eyes. Taking it all out, she displayed it like a fan and kissed it. Then she saw a piece of paper fall out. Picking it up, she saw that it was a note from Ralph. "I do hope you're reading this, Julie, because if you are, that means you're here. I did wonder if you'd got cold feet and changed your mind. I hope not. I have a little business to do, but I'll be back as soon as possible, and maybe we could have dinner. In the meantime, go shopping, enjoy yourself, and welcome to London, my love. And for the record, I do love you, Julie. Ralph. Kiss." Looking at the note again, she smiled. A wave of relief washed over her. It seemed she wasn't the only one who'd had doubts. Even when she'd called him to tell him what train she would be on, he still hadn't been sure if she'd meant it. It seemed they'd both had their doubts once leaving the warmth of each other's arms and the cold light of day had crept in. A wide grin crossed her face and her eyes lit up at the wad of cash in her hand. Walking into the bathroom, she turned off the taps and pulled the plug out, watching all those scented soapsuds float away. Sod the bath! This was London! Oxford Street and streets full of shops. Stuffing the money in her handbag, she slipped on her shoes and coat. "Look out, London! Julie's here!" She laughed aloud and slammed the door behind her. Chapter 2. Stool Pigeon. Walking down the small side street in the East End of London, Ralph retraced his steps. It was only a few years ago that he'd been down this way. However, he remembered the owner of one particular pub very well. Charlie Jenkins was an egotistical, self-important pimp and publican, too caught up in his own affairs to give a damn about anyone else, and that was just the way Ralph wanted it. He was just what Ralph and his Italian business partner Carlos needed to cover their tracks. Ralph remembered the first time he'd met Charlie during his very first stay in London. Ralph had gone to the East End in expectation of something, he wasn't sure of what. The myths and reputation that surrounded the place seemed like one of London's biggest tourist attractions, apart from Buckingham Palace. It had started to rain, and so he'd gone into the first pub he saw for cover. The small pub on the corner with its blacked-out windows and peeling paint hadn't looked inviting, but it served a purpose. On opening the door, the blast of music that greeted him was almost deafening. The noise from the customers' laughter and cheers had made him turn his head in the direction of their shouts. In the far corner, he spotted a makeshift triangular stage surrounded by all walks of life. Dancing on it provocatively was a half-naked woman shaking her breasts towards the crowd, making them cheer and clap even louder. He'd never expected this. Now he understood the blacked-out windows. This was very different from Ireland and the pubs he'd visited there. Pushing his way through the crowd, Ralph walked up to the bar. He leant forward and cupped his hand around his mouth. "Whiskey!" he shouted to make himself heard over the music. The busty barmaid, who looked flustered and rushed off her feet, quickly turned to the optics behind the bar and held a glass under the whiskey bottle. Without saying a word, she held a hand out for the money. Handing it over, he shouted again, "Is there any chance of a clean glass?" pointing out the faint lipstick mark still on the rim of his glass from its predecessor to make his point. Picking up a soiled tea towel, she took the glass and wiped the rim. "That's as good as you're going to get here, mate." Smiling at her and shrugging, he raised his glass to her and took a sip of the whiskey, which warmed him. The barmaid's permed blonde hair with its black roots hypnotised him. It was stationary as she moved her head from side to side, pulling pints for thirsty customers. There must have been a whole can of hair lacquer on it. "Hello, mate. You're a long way from home." A short, stocky man tapped him on the shoulder, clearly wanting to make his presence known. "Am I?" Raising one eyebrow and taking another sip of his whiskey, Ralph took stock of the stranger in a suit, standing there as if Ralph should know who he was. He noticed two men, also in suits, standing a few feet behind him. It was clear they were this man's minders or henchmen. Either way, these young men stood there trying to intimidate Ralph. "Well, me and my boys here haven't seen you in here before." Jerking his thumb behind him to make their presence known and to point out he wasn't alone should Ralph give him trouble, he gave a jolly laugh. "Irish, innit? That accent of yours?" "You're right, considering I've hardly said anything and you can hear me above the music. Yes, I'm from Ireland." Staying calm and with his eyes firmly focused on the men standing behind this man, Ralph smiled and held out his hand. "Ralph is the name, sir. And what is yours, might I ask?" The three of them laughed as though he had said something funny. Holding out his hand, the man shook Ralph's. "Charlie Jenkins. That's my name, and this is my place. You must be a very long way from home, Ralph, if you've never heard of me." Again he turned to the men behind him for confirmation of his importance. Status seemed to mean everything to Charlie Jenkins, and those two behind him just agreed with everything he said to appease him. Beckoning the barmaid over, he made a big show of his authority. "Whiskey, and leave the bottle," he barked at her. During the proffered drinks, which Ralph knew were to loosen his tongue, a barrage of questions was thrown at him. It was more like a Spanish Inquisition about where he lived and why he was here. Most of all, the underlying question was why he had chosen to come into this pub. Ralph was puzzled. A publican who didn't like new faces? It didn't make sense, unless, of course, he had something to be paranoid about. Ralph came to the conclusion that Charlie, with all his front and wide boy ways, was frightened of something or someone, as though he was expecting trouble from strangers. "Do you normally ask so many questions about the men who frequent your pub to admire your lovely ladies?" Ralph nodded to the overweight stripper in the far corner. Christ, this place was sleazy. She looked older than his mother did. Ralph had answered all of his questions calmly, telling him everything about himself, but nothing at the same time. "I was in the area, and with the rain coming down, your pub found me," he remarked. Throwing his arms open wide, embracing his empire, and spilling some of his whiskey from his glass on the threadbare faded carpet, Charlie beamed with pride. "This is my place, Irish Ralph. I know most of the punters in here, and they know me as the boss man. You want something? I'm the man to come to. With me and my boys here keeping the East End safe, your granny is able to walk home late at night with her bingo winnings. Nothing happens on my turf."
Charlie was becoming louder and a little worse for wear after consuming so much of his own whisky, while Ralph had sipped sparingly at his own. This was all bravado, and Ralph wasn't impressed. Listening as Charlie boasted about his status in the East End and how feared he was, each time turning to his men to confirm what he was saying, Ralph had almost laughed aloud. In the space of a couple of hours, Charlie had told Ralph everything about himself. Well, almost. He hadn't mentioned the colour of his underwear. So this drunk, overweight fool was known as the boss man in local parts. Charlie Jenkins was a minor crook who hired young boys to do his fighting for him. This run-down pub, with its overweight strippers and faded carpets, was his empire. What a joke! Charlie enjoyed throwing his weight around, expecting everyone to tremble in his wake. He was a sleazy laughing-stock. Nevertheless, he was entertaining, Ralph had to admit that. It almost reminded Ralph of his friend back home, Paddy. A few drinks down his throat loosened Paddy's tongue as he tried to impress people, and Charlie Jenkins was no different. They had parted company with a shake of hands, like old friends. That had been a few years ago now, when Ralph hadn't been sure if he had enough money to pay the hotel bill, and he thought Don Carlos had duped him. Of course he'd been wrong. Time and an ever-growing bank account had proved that. When Carlos had suggested they needed a fall guy for the money laundering at an old West End nightclub they'd recently acquired, Charlie Jenkins, a big fish in a small pond, had instantly popped into Ralph's head. After doing his homework and dropping Charlie's name amongst his newfound friends and police commissioners, Ralph had also found out that not only was Charlie known to the police, he was also one of their regular informers. This high and mighty man with his gangster profile regularly tipped off the police with information about rival gangs on the south of the river. This was the angle Ralph and Carlos liked. It was insurance. If the other gangs ever found out that it was Charlie who had put their friends behind bars, his life wouldn't be worth living. Today was a very different visit to Charlie's pub. Ralph knew that whatever deal he offered, Charlie would agree to it. The stakes were high, and the offer on the table was more than Charlie could ever imagine. Smiling to himself as he approached the run-down pub with its once red, peeling paint, Ralph knew the boss man would agree to his offer without a second thought. Life was strange, Ralph mused to himself. His chance meeting with Charlie had been an accident, and now he would be a godsend. On entering, Ralph noticed that nothing had changed. Inside was still black, apart from the few disco lights in the far corner lighting up the triangular stage. As was the first time he went in, there were men laughing and shouting at the ageing stripper, overly made up and overweight. Some women, obviously prostitutes, wearing very short dresses to go with their stockings and suspenders, were sitting at tables crowded with half-empty glasses and overflowing ashtrays, hoping someone would join them. At least the darkness of the pub hid the dismal decoration. Pushing his way to the bar, Ralph looked around for his target. Ordering a drink and scanning the room, he didn't have long to wait. Hearing laughter coming from a far-off corner booth, Ralph cocked his head to one side and followed the merriment. There he was, Charlie Jenkins in all of his glory, surrounded by a group of men holding court. Picking up his drink, Ralph walked slowly over to the booth. "Hello, Mr. Jenkins. Nice to see you again. Can I get you a drink?" As Ralph approached the crowd and spoke directly to Charlie, the laughter stopped.
Everyone looked up at Ralph, puzzled and curious, not knowing who he was. Seeing no recognition in Charlie's eyes, Ralph prompted him. "It's been a long time since I was in these parts, and my Irish accent isn't as strong as it used to be. But the last time you made me very welcome in your establishment." Still nothing, although Ralph did notice how Charlie looked at the suit he was wearing. "Should I remember you, mate? This is a private party, and I know a lot of people." "I just remember you saying that night if there was ever anything someone wanted, you were the man to come to." Turning on the charm and flattering someone like Charlie was the key. Showing him the respect he thought he deserved was Ralph's way in. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Jenkins." Shrugging and turning around, Ralph slowly walked back to the bar, knowing he was about to hook the fish. "Wait! Yeah, I remember you. The Irishman. We had a few drinks together," Charlie shouted. Ralph turned around. Ralph had a feeling that Charlie didn't have a clue who he was, but didn't want to look foolish in front of friends. "Thanks for that, Mr. Jenkins." Keeping it on a formal basis, Ralph held out his hand to shake Charlie's, making a big show of how happy he was that Charlie was giving him the time of day. "Of course I'll remember you. Oi, you lot, get my friend here a drink." Charlie waved his arms around, giving orders, while moving up in the corner booth so that Ralph could sit beside him. "Is there somewhere we could talk more privately?" Looking directly at him, Ralph waited as Charlie looked around at the men sitting at his table suspiciously, then back at him. "We can have a drink here. Here, let me introduce the lads." "I did say in private, Mr. Jenkins." Ralph's calm, authoritative voice stopped them all talking again. "You tooled up, mate? Got something you want to give me in the office, eh?" Charlie was laughing, but when he noticed that Ralph didn't smile, he quickly stopped. "Yeah, sure. This had better be good," Charlie warned as he stood up and straightened his tie. He didn't want to lose face, but he could see that Ralph was deadly serious. Given his dress code and his manner, he knew this man wasn't looking for cheap thrills. Following Charlie's lead into the back room, which was even worse than the front of house, Ralph looked around. This man's so-called office was a dump, considering he portrayed himself as the boss of the manor. His desk was nothing more than one of the pub's old wooden tables, which still had the stained rings of the beer glasses embedded in the wood. Newspapers were scattered everywhere, mainly the horse racing pages, along with half-empty takeaway boxes. The whole place stank to high heaven. Not exactly the image of a self-made man making a fortune. This made the offer he was going to make to Charlie seem like a dream come true. Leave this dump and go to the West End. There was no comparison. Satisfied with his choice, Ralph waited while Charlie picked up a few newspapers off a wooden chair and invited him to sit down. This was exactly what Ralph wanted, a fool chasing fool's gold. Charlie would take the carrot Ralph was about to dangle in front of him if it enriched his reputation. He would also take the meagre offering Ralph was prepared to pay. More to the point, he would take all the blame. "So, what can I do for you? Sorry, your name escapes me again." "Let's leave names aside for now. I'm sure it will come back to you." "OK, let's have it. What do you want? You're not the police, because I've never seen one wearing a suit like that." Looking down at his own suit, Charlie brushed away the cigarette ash that had fallen on his lapel. "Neither have I, Charlie, neither have I," Ralph smiled. "I have a club over in the West End. It needs someone with knowledge of how things work, with a reputation like yours to look after it." "The West End? You're asking me to be a manager in a club? That's a bloody insult. You want a bar boy. Do you know who you're talking to? His arrogance and anger rising, Charlie's sneering face flushed. I do, or I wouldn't be here. If your club is in the West End, mister, you can get a manager anywhere. They'd bite your hands off. Taking in Ralph's appearance and relaxed, calm manner, Charlie was curious. Reaching down and opening a drawer, he took out 2 glasses and a whisky bottle and held up the bottle to Ralph. Ralph nodded to accept the drink. Charlie poured and Ralph carried on, knowing that he had now captured his interest. I said someone with your knowledge and reputation, someone with his eyes open and his mouth shut. What you do and earn from the club is irrelevant. Ralph shrugged and sat back on his chair. He could see Charlie's brain was trying to get to grips with what he was saying. What exactly are you going to be using this club for? A bit of this and that. Are we talking drugs? We're talking money laundering, maybe. But if it's too much for you, I'm sorry to have wasted your valuable time. Standing up, Ralph held out his hand to shake Charlie's. The greed in Charlie's eyes was apparent. He was already weighing up the odds and running his tongue over his lips to moisten them. Charlie picked up his drink and took a gulp. Sit down, sit down. It's just a lot to take in all at once. Give me a minute before you walk, eh? Nothing's too big for me. You know that or you wouldn't be here. My boys and I can handle anything. So what's in it for me? Sitting down again, Ralph smiled. This really was cat and mouse. As I say, I have a club in the West End. It hasn't been used for some time, but you could put your name above the door and run it however you see fit. All profits would be yours. I won't interfere. So why don't you do it? I'm no publican, Charlie. You know how things are run, and you know how to turn a blind eye. This could be very lucrative for you. In fact, very lucrative for us both. Nodding and smiling at him, Ralph waited. Yeah, and I'm also the fall guy with my name above the door. Gulping back his drink in one, Charlie started to pour himself another, proffering the bottle to Ralph. No thanks. I think it's time I left. Maybe I've said too much. Ralph realised it was now time to play his insurance card just to keep Charlie in check. We both know that you have friends in high places, especially the police force. Pausing, Ralph waited for his words to sink into Charlie's brain. What do you mean by that? You saying I'm some sort of grass or something? Suddenly Charlie reached into his jacket pocket and took out a gun, pointing it at Ralph. It's a shame you didn't get that suit in red, Mr. Whatever your name is. No one calls Charlie Jenkins a grass. Do you fucking hear me, you Irish prat? Holding his hands up in submission, Ralph realised he had touched a raw nerve. This man had more to fear than Ralph had first thought. I never said that, Mr. Jenkins, but it is understood that a clever, prosperous man as yourself always knows someone who knows someone else. That is good business. No offence meant. Looking into the barrel of the gun pointed at him, Ralph wanted to knock it out of his hands and punch him hard, but now wasn't the time or the place. I'll leave you in peace now. My apologies. Here is my number if you change your mind. Ralph gave Charlie an untraceable number of a telephone and answering machine left in an old council house that had been deserted by its tenants. Then he put his hands in his trouser pockets and crossed his fingers as he turned to leave, hoping he wouldn't end up with a bullet in his back. This nervous, trigger-happy fool was capable of anything, especially after a few drinks. Pushing his way through the crowd, Ralph stopped at the table with Charlie's men still sitting there and nodded. "Evening, gentlemen." Each one of them looked at him with surprise, looked over their shoulders to where Charlie's office was, and then back at Ralph. These clever gangster boys. Not one of them had thought to frisk him in case he had a weapon. Already it proved to him just how amateur they were. No one was ever allowed in Don Carlos's rooms without being searched first. It was standard procedure. Hook, line and sinker, thought Ralph as he looked down at the faces of these so-called mobsters. It had been easier than he'd thought, and he knew Charlie would ring the telephone number he'd given him as soon as he left the office. Satisfied with the outcome, Ralph congratulated himself on one of his better brainwaves. That council flat was a brilliant smokescreen, and one that would come in handy many times in the future. Stepping outside, Ralph inhaled the fresh air. Now his business was done, and he would go and have dinner with Julie. He wasn't sure if she was in London or not, but it was a nice thought after what he'd just been through. Waving his hand out for a black taxi, Ralph laughed to himself. He wasn't sure what was worse, looking down the barrel of a gun, or Julie's wrath at being so late after her arrival. At least she made him laugh, and she smelt and looked decidedly better than this dump. Chapter 3. Harsh Truths. Good evening, Mr. Gold. Your wife has arrived safely. I just thought you would like to know. Thank you. Although calm on the outside, inside Ralph was jumping for joy. She was here. The lift didn't go up fast enough, and at last he was swinging the hotel room door open and stepping inside. The first thing he did was nearly trip over. Julie had indeed been shopping. There were bags and clothing sprawled all over the bed and the floor. Turning from the mirror as she heard the door open, Julie beamed. "Ralph, you're a sight for sore eyes. How are you, darling? Do you think this skirt suits me? Oh, damn it, I'm not ready yet." Almost breathless and trying to compose himself, he discarded a coat hanger with a bra on it that had caught on his shoe. "Not ready. I've been gone for hours. I'm glad you came, Julie." Flustered and excited, Ralph walked towards her. Shaking his head, he couldn't believe it. Their meetings were never as he imagined they would be. It wasn't like this in the movies, where the romantic couple always ran to each other across meadows and crowded streets. But not him and Julie. He had nearly fallen over a coat hanger attached to his foot. Although, he reasoned as he watched her happily parading her new clothes to him, at least she wasn't angry with him. She wasn't some nagging woman complaining that he hadn't met her at the station and left her alone for so long. This was his Julie, and this was the height of their romance. Julie was standing half-naked in front of the long mirror, admiring her new clothes, taking off a blouse she had bought and getting ready to try on another one. Looking around at Ralph, her happy smile brought a smile to his face. "Is that a gun in your pocket, Ralph Gold, or are you pleased to see me?" Cocking his head to one side and grinning, Ralph put his arm behind him and put his hand in the waistband of his trousers, pulling out a gun. He put it on the dresser at the side of him. Then he pulled down the zip of his trousers. "Both, I would say." The eruption of laughter as they both jumped on the bed amongst Julie's multitude of clothes flying in the air made for a happy reunion.
"Well, that was all very nice, Ralph. However, I'm hungry now. Let's get showered and go to the restaurant." Lying back on his arms as he rested on the bedhead, Ralph felt disappointed. He wanted Julie to himself tonight.
"We could always order room service and stay here."
"No, not with all these new clothes I've bought, or rather you bought. Come on, move your lovely arse and get dressed." "Anyway," her voice echoed from the bathroom as she ran the shower, "this is no different to my bedsit, a room at the top of a building. It just has better carpets and room service."
Ralph couldn't help laughing to himself. Here she was in one of London's finest hotels with every amenity, and she had just compared it to her top-floor bedsit. Pulling back the cover, he got out of bed, walked to the bathroom and opened the sliding door to the shower. The steam from the shower blocked his view a little, and he waited until the mist cleared and watched as the water rained down on Julie's head and body. Wiping away the water from her eyes, she looked up at Ralph standing there. "Well, are you coming in then, or are you just going to watch?" "So, we've had our fun, we're eating dinner, and now it's down to business." As he put down his knife and fork, Julie noticed this was Ralph's serious face. She had started to pick up on some of Ralph's little habits over the time she had known him. "What is it?" Putting down her own knife and fork, she sat back on her chair and folded her arms. This was what she had been dreading, the cold light of day. He'd obviously been thinking. "Firstly, we need to sort out little Josh and get him transferred to London. You're going to have to sort that out, so that's your job for tomorrow." Puzzled, Julie looked across the table in the dimly lit hotel restaurant. This was not the conversation she had expected. "You want to do that for Josh?" Her mouth felt dry and she reached for her glass of wine. She suddenly felt humble. Ralph was an unusual man. She felt so relieved that he was including Josh in their plans. Some men would have discarded him, especially with the problems he had. It's not as though he was her own child. Some men didn't want women with baggage. But once again Ralph had astonished her. His kindness and sincerity seemed to know no boundaries. "Yes, of course. You do come out with some silly things sometimes." Now it was his turn to look surprised. As much as they had shared a bed and each other's bodies, it seemed they were still skirting around each other. "I have an early meeting in the morning with Carlos, so I will be pretty much tied up all day. You sort out Josh, and we're going to need to start looking at houses. We can't stay here forever, not now we have a family to look after. So that's another job for you. Find some brochures or something." Ralph waved his hand in the air dismissively. He had something to say, and he wanted to get it off his chest. Feeling herself blush slightly and sitting quietly, Julie let him finish his speech. She felt nervous and her hands felt sweaty. Ralph seemed to be railroading her with all of his plans. "I do hope you're not one of those control freaks," she smiled. She didn't want to sound ungrateful, but she needed to get her point over. "I've always been independent. I appreciate what you're saying, and I know you mean well, but please give me time to take it all in. I would like to discuss our plans, not just yours." Ralph stopped short. He hadn't meant this to sound overbearing, like he was taking over. That wasn't what he meant at all. Reaching for her hand, he squeezed it. "I'm sorry, Julie." His voice was almost a hushed whisper. Now he was the one that was blushing slightly. Julie was right, of course. He knew that. She was a woman with a mind of her own, unlike his first wife. Irene had relied...